On behalf of the Great Cities Institute and the Native American Support Services here at the University of Illinois, Chicago, we welcome you to UIC and we welcome you to this event. In the spirit of healing, we would also like to begin by acknowledging and honoring the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, including the Three Fires Confederacy, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe Nation, as well as other tribal nations, including the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, and the very many other indigenous people who've been part of the Chicagoland area for all of its time, past, present, and future. So again, thank you. We really appreciate your presence, and we want to give a special thank you to all of the panelists who have come from various parts of the city and even the nation to join us here today. We're going to get right to it with no further ado, and I'm struggling because I left my glasses right here, and here they are. Yay. So the first thing I want to do, though, before I forget, I want to give a huge shout out to CAN TV, because they are such an important community asset for all of us here in the Chicagoland area. They're our public access television, and they're just really great at going to a lot of events, particularly around nonprofit groups throughout the whole city. So encourage you to find CAN TV on your various networks and support them in any way that you can. Also want to acknowledge here in the room folks from the Native American Student Organization here at UIC campus. So we're glad that you all are here. And again, on behalf of Great Cities as well as the Native American Support Services, Cynthia Soto in particular and her staff, Jacob and others, we welcome you. We're really pleased that Janine Commonout is here with us today. She's traveled from Seattle, Washington. She is an enrolled member of the Commonout Indian Nation. She's the founding executive director of the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. So she'll tell you more about this coalition, but it's a really important national coalition working with various indigenous folks from different cities, 28 urban cities, Indian centers in 22 cities, working with more than 2 million Native Americans living away from their traditional land base. The NUIFC remains one of only a few national organizations dedicated to making the invisible visible and providing a platform and voice for this underrepresented population in America. Janine is a graduate of Leadership Tomorrow, a regional leadership program, is a 1999 alumni of the prestigious Americans for Indian Opportunity Ambassador Program, and was chosen and highlighted in O Magazine, Oprah's magazine, for her participation in Women Rule, 80 Women Who Could Change America. She is a recipient of the Potlatch Fund Fran James Cultural Preservation Award and the prestigious Echo Trust Indigenous Leadership Award for her work with urban Indians. She has presented urban Indian issues at the White House, the United Nations, and as a keynote speaker at numerous conferences. Additionally, she has been a Human Rights Commissioner for the City of Seattle, and she's currently a board member for the Praxis Project, here for Praxis. This is a national organization. This is where I first met Janine. This is a national organization that works with many community groups on the ground working on issues of health within our communities. She has worked for besides Praxis, she also sits on the External Diversity and Inclusion Council for Charter Communications. She worked for 16 years at the United Nations of All Tribes Foundation in child welfare, juvenile justice, poverty reduction, and as a development officer. And I know that you have some information in your programs about Janine, but I wanted to make sure we also reached our CAN TV audience, but also to really remind us that we have a very wonderful, hardworking, committed individual who's visited us here at UIC today, and we welcome you, Janine, to present a few remarks, and then we'll open it to the other panelists.
Again, my name is Janine Commonout, and I'm an enrolled member of the Quinault Indian Nation, which is on the west coast of Washington State. My father was Oglala from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and Quinault. My mother is Heshkwit from southern Vancouver Island in Canada, and Quaggle from northern Vancouver Island in Canada. And I like to fondly call myself a child of boarding schools. So 4 different tribes, they all came together at the Chemawa Boarding School, which was in Oregon. Like Teresa said, I'm the founding executive director of the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. And really our coalition really came about from my 18 years of working on the ground in a community-based organization, and just kind of genuine curiosity. I wanted to know if working in child welfare, and particularly working within juvenile justice, with a lot of, actually within the justice system itself, but also on the streets. I wanted to know if other cities face the same kinds of issues that we faced in Seattle. As many of you know, Seattle we can have a little bit of a bubble around us sometimes. So I just literally got on the phone one day and started calling, and the American Indian Center of Chicago was my very first phone call. So I like to tell people that the Indian Center in Chicago was our very first founding member. They jumped on board. Back in 2003, I cold called 12 Indian centers across the country and asked them if they wanted to come to Seattle to really discuss issues that faced our children and families, our Native children and families that lived in these various cities. As these 12 executive directors from all the way from Anchorage to Chicago to the Bay Area, Phoenix, Albuquerque, all of the big cities across the country came together, these folks sat in a circle and realized that they had never sat in a circle before, and that they didn't know that all of these other cities, that all of these different organizations from budgets at 100,000 to budgets of 18 million really had a lot of commonality that we face together. And the primary one being is that we are so often invisible within these big cities in which we live. So our work, starting in 2003, really did evolve to becoming more, as we did our work, and we, back in 2008, I was like, I want to meet at the White House. So I called the White House and said, can I meet there? And they said, yeah. And I said, okay. So we had this big meeting at the White House, which was pretty cool. I miss Obama, because you could do that then. But we realized as we were all sitting there talking that we were not just invisible within the context of these cities that we live in. We were also invisible nationally. A lot of people just don't know about Natives, and a lot of people really don't understand that over 70% of all American Indians that live in the United States live off reservation. Most of us actually live in cities. We think about 65 to 68% actually live within metropolitan statistical areas. Again, Chicago, I'm going to keep bringing this back to Chicago because I have a soft spot in my heart for Chicago, but it's also one of the most important urban Indian communities in the country. It is, along with Phoenix, and we'll let them duke it out which one was formed first, but they were formed around the same time, is what I like to say, to stay neutral. Sorry, Heather. But so Phoenix and Chicago were the first two to really organize their American Indian communities and form a center. And that was back in the 50s, I want to say. So, when we look at what I call urban Indian America, we're really looking at, again, as with a lot of community organizing throughout the nation, birthplace Chicago. So a lot of the service delivery models actually grew out of the American Indian Center in Chicago. A lot of the community organizing that happened in order to make the Indian Center happen here, and a lot of our cities throughout the nation have really looked towards this community to figure out how to establish Indian centers and all of that. So the NUIFC, again, to go back to our meeting at the White House, we realized that we were largely invisible. When we first started, we were really looking at issues around Indian child welfare, around juvenile justice, around sort of direct service delivery to families. So all of our centers really are located on the ground. They're delivering services to community, in community, by community. And that was something as we were forming that we felt was really important. We have some health centers, but there is a national organization that really does look at health, and that's not really what we do. So we really look at education and employment and housing and all of those other things that are the human experience within these big urban areas that aren't health. So at that meeting in Washington, D.C. was when we really began to realize that from a national perspective, there was just so much that people didn't know about our community. So our focus didn't necessarily shift away from sort of direct service delivery and working with organizations that do direct service delivery. It really became more that we realized that we needed to educate folks a lot more about the American Indian experience as it relates to our urban experiences. Because almost every major city in America has an urban Indian center that provides services to its constituencies. Not to go too deeply into the sort of legislative disassembly of American Indian peoples, we all got to the city because it was legislated. So a lot of people don't know that the reason there is such a huge urban American Indian population in the United States really dates back to the Relocation Act. So the Relocation Act congressionally mandated that it was an act that told American Indians living on reservations at the time that if you go to these cities, Chicago was one of those cities, Chicago was one of the original Relocation Act cities. If you go to Chicago, there's jobs and housing, and you'll be able to seamlessly integrate into the city. I think you guys can probably assume that didn't quite happen when our Native people got to the cities. But what it did create was multi-generations of Native people who moved away from our homelands and our reservations and ended up staying in these cities. And Chicago in particular, I think you all are on like your fourth or fifth generation of American Indians who were born and raised in Chicago. So part of the genesis of these urban Indian centers was during the Relocation Act, like Chicago and Oakland and Portland and Seattle and, Dallas and all of these cities across America. Denver was a big one. These native folks got to these cities, realized there were no jobs, there wasn't really any housing, there wasn't really much there, but then they were sort of stuck. So these Indian centers really grew out of I always say that our Native centers are in many ways reactive, so they are primed to react to what the community's needs are. So whether it's housing or childcare or health or any employment, education, any number of sort of social needs that our communities have, these American Indian centers throughout the country really endeavor to try and provide for those needs, because Native people will travel a good long distance to get culturally relevant services. I don't think we're unique in that. I think a lot of humans will go to where they're most comfortable. So in that way, so not only are these urban Indian centers service providers, they're also, I like to call them embassies. So like you just heard, I'm 4 tribes. You're going to hear another 5 or 6 tribes coming down this line right here. In any city, any of these urban Indian centers are often providing services in a range from anywhere from 50 to 200 to 300 different tribes. So like here in Chicago, each city has its sort of geographic magnet. So in Chicago, you're going to have a lot of Menominee and Ho-Chunk and Ojibwe. You're going to see a lot of the people who are from that tribal group. But also Chicago has the largest, outside of Phoenix, it's the second largest population of Navajos in the country. So there every major city has a lot of Indians. So in a lot of ways, these centers become sort of, I call them tribal embassies, because this is where our people come to be with other Native people, to be with people who know our culture, to be with people who understand, sort of the live Native experience and what that means, and to, form fellowship with one another and create community, because I think all humans want community. And when you come from a tribal community, even if that tribal community's, on the south side or west side of Chicago, it's still a community. And so these urban Indian centers really do become a place where people congregate, and you'll see that the American Indian Center has a powwow, and there's all kinds of cultural events that happen. A lot of our centers host sweats and ceremony and all the things that make us feel welcome and comfortable as Native people. So that's sort of a very abbreviated version of what I call Urban Indian 101. Since then, the NUIFC, we really began looking at, after the White House meeting, we realized that we needed to create information about urban Indians, and really looking at the relationship between policy and outcomes and community development and community organizing. So we had this idea that we would begin doing policy roundtables. So we did 11 policy roundtables throughout the country in 11 cities. Chicago was one. Actually, Chicago was our first one. And we really, one of the things that we do know when we look at policy for American Indians is that American Indian populations tend to make up, in general, less than 3% of any city's population. That's about the average. In Chicago, it's less than 1%, because this is a huge city. But, same with Los Angeles. But when you begin to drill down and look at socioeconomic indicators and the outcomes for them, you'll find that American Indian children and American Indian people, we tend to sit at the bottom of those. So we are disproportionately overrepresented in negative indicators. So even if we're less, like, for instance, in Seattle, where I'm from, Natives are about 2% of the population. In King County, we're 13% of the children in foster care. So it's that kind of overrepresentation. In Los Angeles, it's the same thing around homelessness and around child welfare. So looking at those, we realize that our impact on policy arenas is much larger, and it's disproportionate to our numbers within the city. And so what we wanted to know is, are policymakers actually addressing that disproportionate impact? And the only way we could figure that out was to go talk to policymakers. So we actually did a bunch of policy roundtables, and we wanted to know, like, how aware were Native people of policy as it relates to their communities, and then how aware were policymakers about Native communities and about the outcomes related to Native communities. So we actually did this kind of interesting process where we had a non-Native woman who we had facilitate this whole process, because we ran a bit of a social experiment, which I kind of called a Black Like Me experiment. We had her meet with the policymakers separately, because in our experience, and some of you maybe have also experienced this as well, policymakers will often tell you what they think you want to hear. Politicians can do the same thing. But we really wanted to drill down and figure out, like, what's the issue? Like, why aren't you working with our communities? Because the resource base was not matching the disproportionate impact base. And it actually worked. So we had a lot of policymakers who gave us a bunch of different reasons about why they weren't working with our communities. And the foremost being was that they didn't know about us. They didn't know that we were necessarily living in their city. And I attended one of them, and an elected official in Los Angeles County actually said, "Why do I have to deal with Native Americans? Because they don't vote." I literally was like, yes, we do. But that gives you sort of an idea of what we're dealing with. And so then, again, what I brought back to this policymaker was to say, well, that's true, except for that less than 1% of your population and 9% of your children in foster care, elected official guy, you're still paying. Your policy decisions are still paying for this, so you might as well work on the preventative end. So we did this project, and really what came out of that was, from the community side, was a set of policy directions that our communities themselves wanted to see addressed, and they're all the ones we thought would happen, being education. Transportation was a huge one. That came up in every city. Education, transportation, employment, early childhood development, coalition building and leadership building was a big one that came out. And the biggest one, which is sort of the third rail in Indian country, was the tribal-urban divide. We saw it at both the policymaker side, and we saw it on our community side as well, is that there's so much confusion about the difference between our tribal governments and our people who live in the city. And policymakers often think that if they work with a tribal government, then they're working with all of the Indians, which just simply isn't true in most of our cities. Here in Illinois, you guys don't have tribes here, so that's kind of taken off the table in a city like Chicago. But it was fascinating. So our work from there really began to launch off of those arenas. So we're methodically working through each of those and trying to create information about urban Indians from all over the country in those arenas. So we recently finished a paper on education, looking at alternative education and major school systems and how they can begin to work with urban Indian students better, what school districts can do, what philanthropy can do, and a big overview on the history of urban Indian education. We just finished a paper on the urban Indian digital divide, because we realize that a lot of our people are really connecting to the web via their phones and not at home or not on laptops. And then the next piece looking at that project was really about the need for more civic engagement. So we just recently finished, like last week, it ended on the election was the last day of a piece of that project. We funded 17 cities throughout the country, of which Chicago was one, and oh my God, Chicago's so cool. They did such good work. We funded urban Indian centers to do civic engagement and integrated voter engagement work, and really to get out the vote, like not just talk about voting, but actually go do it. And in the cities that we funded, we actually saw our first two Native Congresswomen go to the United States Congress, and they were urban Indians. So Kansas City and Albuquerque have just elected their first Native women to go to Congress, and in part that was because we did a pretty significant investment into those cities, but also just this notion that we also had our centers work with other communities of color, and really we're beginning to, that's sort of our next phase, is really beginning the process of integrating Native people into broader people of color conversations. Because even within communities of color, we're often an afterthought. We're often not even at those tables of other people of color within these big cities. And so part of our intent with the NUIFC is to really begin rectifying that, and how do we begin to integrate Native culture and our Native people who live in these big cities into these broader conversations, especially when you begin looking at IVE, integrated voter engagement, or civic engagement, and what that means for all of our communities. And we actually think that Native people have a lot to offer by the way of our worldview to other communities. We've been here a damn long time, and we've survived a lot. And so I think that, the way that our cultural worldview plays out within our communities, we think is actually can be educational for all communities, not just other POC communities. We think it's educational for all communities. So I'll leave it at that because I'll talk forever given the choice, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Janine. That was perfect. And you heard her say it. Chicago is so cool. Well, we're happy you're here with us. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to have each of the panelists speak about 5 minutes, and there's some seats up front and here in the middle if you guys want to come in and join us. And so we're going to have the panelists, each of them speak for about 5 to 7 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up kind of for some discussion. We'll pass around some cards at that point too, and you all may put your questions on it. I want to be sure also before any further time passes that I acknowledge the staff of Great Cities Institute for their help in organizing this. Yes, thank you. And we also have some great partners in the room that I want to acknowledge. Amanda Lewis from the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy is here. Norma Ramos from the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, who does so much of the heavy lifting over there. Rachel Haverlock from Freshwater Labs is here. And then also our dean from our library, Mary Case, is here. So I want to thank you all for being here. So let me, I'm not going to go into a long reading of the bios. You have them in your program. For those of you who are watching this from the CAN TV audience, or we'll see it later on video, it will be on we'll put the bios on the website and you can look at them. But we have, I'm just going to tell you real quickly, just their name and their organizational affiliation, and then we'll just go down the row here, starting here. So Jasmine Kern, and you all can correct my pronunciations of your names, is Manager for Native American and Indigenous Initiatives of the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion at Northwestern University. And one of the things that's really awesome that she's going to share with us is the great work they're doing at Northwestern University. They've really been putting some resources, and some attention into really making Northwestern a friendly place for Natives. So welcome, Jasmine, to UIC. Heather Miller is an enrolled member of the Wyandot Nation from Oklahoma. She has a passion for seeing Native American organizations succeed. So she's going to share with us her thoughts. Kenneth Scott is the executive director of the AIHSC, which I know he'll tell us what that is. Oh, he didn't make it. Okay. So Cynthia. All right. Well, Cynthia then is Cynthia, raise your hand, Cynthia. She's obviously we're co-sponsoring this with Cynthia. She's awesome. Cynthia, it's always so great to work with you. And I should also point out that one of the things we've been doing with Cynthia is working on an undergraduate internship class or internship opportunity to work with Native groups in the city of Chicago. So if you want for information on that program, you can speak with Cynthia afterwards. So Cynthia is an enrolled Sigangu Lakota, and she's Puerto Rican. She was born and raised in Chicago and grew up in Bucktown and attended the local elementary and high schools there. Anthony Tamez challenges misconceptions about urban Native youth and is co-president of Shy Nations Youth Council in Chicago. And did I miss anybody? I missed you. No, I got everybody. Okay. Okay, so with that then, let's just go down the row, and if you all can spend just a few minutes saying whatever you want to for the next 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Poso, can everyone hear me okay? All right, I have a thumbs up in the back. Poso Mawanoweak, my name is Jasmine Kern. I'm Oneida and Menominee, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a mother of 2, and I work as a manager at Northwestern University. My position's located in the office of the provost, so doing central work university-wide with Native American and Indigenous initiatives. I wanted to share a little bit about my background and history in formal education spaces. I was born and raised here in Chicago, and I attended my neighborhood elementary school. And for high school, I applied for a college prep school that didn't even have its name yet when I applied. Later was named Walter Payton College Prep, was the first graduating class there. And then I spent 1 year at Indiana University in Bloomington, was very miserable, so I came back to Chicago and finished my bachelor's degree at DePaul University in sociology. And so while I was working on my undergraduate degree, I got 2 part-time jobs working around Natives in education. One was with the Chicago Public Schools American Indian Education Program, and the other was as a research assistant at the American Indian Center. They had received a federal research grant, so I worked for their education department on education research. Both jobs approached supporting Native students in education very differently. One was, supporting students in the Western education system to be successful in that environment, and the other was about creating learning environments that were more, that elevated indigenous knowledge and even education pedagogies. So I spent 2 years interning for CPS, but I went on to work with the AIC for about 10 years. And so that really had an impact on my, career interest, but also how I approach my work even now at Northwestern, in just thinking about higher education and reclaiming that space towards tribal nation building or nation building, and how I think about and see Chicago, how as indigenous land, how I raised my children to be good people, good human beings, and in relationship with the natural world, and so now thinking about that and my work at Northwestern, I started off in student affairs and undergraduate admissions, so how to outreach to Native communities and support the Native students that are at Northwestern. And now it's a little over a year I've been in the central role supporting Native and Indigenous initiatives university-wide, so with students still, but now graduate students, faculty, staff, alumni. And so over the past year, I've developed 4 goals or priority areas for us to approach the work. And one is visibility, increasing awareness, and increasing awareness and visibility of Native presence on campus and the world, their issues, their challenges, their hopes and desires and dreams. And one of the ways that we did that this past year was had a land acknowledgement, much like what you heard at the beginning of today's event at our commencement. Another goal is a relationship building with tribal nations, communities, so it doesn't have to be reservation-based, but the local community, including Chicago. And then an example of that is this past year we renovated, it was $100+ million renovation of our basketball arena, and we procured lumber from the Menominee Nation just 4 hours north for the use of the basketball courts. So now an economic partnership that's not just cultural but economic. They have best sustainability practices, and now that wood will be a part of the basketball arena that the men's basketball, volleyball, wrestling, I believe, plays there. And so that was a really great partnership with the tribe. And then another goal is knowledge, elevating, recentering indigenous knowledge. And with that, we created the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, which focuses on interdisciplinary, so not just Native studies, but it could be science, journalism, education, and research from that indigenous perspective, or addressing the needs of Native communities as well. And then finally is a focus on people, so creating pathways for and support community building around Native students, faculty, staff, future students, faculty, staff, and alumni at Northwestern. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Miller. I am enrolled a Wyandotte from Oklahoma, and I'm going to share a little bit, I guess I also am the executive director of the American Indian Center here in Chicago, that really cool place that everybody's been talking about. I'm going to share a little bit about my background, why I'm here at the Indian Center, and then talk a little bit about our current work and how it relates to a little bit to our history, and a little bit more about what Janine talked about with the formation of her organization.
Just get it closer.
I just have to put it in my mouth.
There you go.
Right. So I have a huge passion for urban Indians. My mom and my uncle were both born on our reservation, and my grandfather decided immediately after that he didn't want any of us to know anything else about our Indian heritage. Moved the family to the booming metropolis of Fargo, North Dakota, and my mom and my uncle both grew up in Fargo. I was born off my reservation, obviously, and so I've had to relearn a lot about our history, relearn a lot about our heritage and where we're from, as well as spend a lot of time reconnecting with my tribe and my history and what that means for myself as an urban Indian. So I was really drawn to working with urban communities and making sure that people who've had very similar experiences to mine do have a place where they can continue to practice their heritage, their culture, and their traditions, as well as provide them with a space that is really unique and special to who we all are as people. The Indian Center here in Chicago, which you guys have heard is so cool, I like to say we really were the first ones, just because of the time when folks were getting organized and thinking about what they wanted to offer and what they wanted to have. So folks who were relocating here to the city of Chicago knew that they needed a space to continue to practice their heritage, their traditions. They needed a space where they could call their own. And so that's how the Indian Center was born. We've always been a place where people from all across the country can come together and share their history, share their heritage. And we continue to do that by providing programs in the arts, providing educational programs, providing cultural programs, and offering select social services to our community as well. One of the things that we also like to do through our education program is to teach folks that Chicago has always been Indian country. We've had a very long history of living in this area and calling this area home. Chicago's always also been a really intertribal community. We have evidence that tribes from all over the place would come to Chicago as a central trading hub. And so you'd find shells from the West Coast here in artwork and in jewelry and in designs, because everyone was coming here to Chicago. It was just a gathering place for people to come together and to share their culture and share their knowledge. And so Chicago's always been this Indian country, as I like to say. And we want to continue that tradition today. We at the Indian Center, we currently serve about 175 different tribes. We are the third largest urban Indian community in the country, so that does mean that we always have quite a bit of drama. We have quite a bit of different viewpoints, and we have a lot of different opinions and ideas about how we should be teaching that culture and how we should be teaching the education work. But in the end, we know that we're all family. We are all coming together for the same purpose of sharing our culture, providing a space for the next generation. And so it's really important for us to always find a way to practice those traditions and to carry on our culture. And so with that, I think I will turn it over to Cynthia.
Hello? It's good? Okay. Hi, I'm Cynthia Soto. I'm director of the Native American program here on campus. I am Lakota, Sichangu Lakota, and Puerto Rican. I am born and raised here in Chicago. I'm a product of Chicago Public Schools, and that's it. And I'm also alumni of UIC. I graduated here years ago. And a big reason I wanted to have these conversations is because working on campus, Native Americans continue to be invisible. We have a small population on campus, but we have a long history. So the Native American Support Program was started over 47 years ago here on campus. I believe it's the second longest program here, working with our populations or with underserved populations. It was created by the community. So there was a number of community members in the 70s and 1979 who decided that it was important that there was services on at UIC to support Native students, specifically Native students who were here already in Chicago, and to get them into higher education. And so I think that's important because it recognized that there was Native people here and there was a population here. And a big part of that was to also engage them back into their communities. And so I like to believe that we still carry that mission as I'm working there today. It was a big part of why I came to a university, came into higher education and got my degree because of a Native program. The Native program provided all the guidance that was necessary, helped me answer questions that I wasn't aware of as a first-generation college student, and helped me along that path. But it also made me aware and realize the importance of giving back to communities. And I feel like we do that today. So our program is, a big part of it is to continue to engage in the local community in any way possible. So we're on committees. We have close relationships with all these people. And it's a big part of why I know and I'm among Native community members in Chicago, because my family is a relocated family. So my mom came from Rosebud, South Dakota when she was a teenager, and my father came from Puerto Rico. They met here and had me and 5 other kids. Yeah, so I believe I'm a first-generation Chicagoan, and my daughter would be a second generation. But because we were growing up in Chicago, we were pretty poor, so we grew up in Uptown area, and that's mainly where we stayed. So my family didn't necessarily use resources of the Chicago Indian community, probably social services when they needed it. But for the most part, I didn't start coming around the community until I was 19. And that was through volunteering. It was through UIC NASP. They made those first connections for me, told me to go volunteer, go help out. And so I did. I think I volunteered with Indian Health Services, and I wish Kenneth was here, but he couldn't make it. And then from there, they've had me ever since. So it's about 20-something odd years of either working with an organization in Chicago for Native people or working for a Native program, and mainly has been in education. So I've worked at the Indian Center, I've worked at Northwestern, I've worked with the Chicago Public Schools in Indian education, and now I'm here at UIC. So for our program, it's really important that our students recognize the importance of their communities, know their histories, and then find ways to give back and to be involved. And so I hope I'm doing that today as I look at a couple of students to remind them about that. And also, you know, I work with a lot of people at UIC who, with no ill intent, continue to think that natives are gone or aren't in the cities. One second. I'm talking longer than I thought. Anyway, and so having this kind of space to kind of realize and understand that there's vibrant organizations that are working with the population in the city is important. It's also important that, to realize that we have a support program for Native students on campus and a resource for non-natives to engage in conversations with us, find out about what's going on. I don't know it all at all. And so if I don't have those answers, I'd like to rely on the community organizations that are represented here at this table, as well as nationally. But I believe that was important to share and to just let you know we're here.
Hamatakiapi Iskwaneni Mianchepie. Hi, my name's Anthony Temez Pochel. I'm West Pacific First Nations Cree and Shichangu Lakota. And I'm part of the Chi Nations Youth Council. I'm the co-president as well as a 2018 Champion for Change for the Center for Native American Youth. So I'll talk about my youth council. We first got started back in 2012 with a mission to create safe space for Native youth through arts, activism, and education. And the youth council is used as that safe space for Natives to get together, because a lot of the times in cities like this, you're the only one in your classroom in school, so you constantly have to stand up and fight for yourself, and you have to stand up and fight for that visibility. So the youth council is a space where we can all come together, and we're all dealing with the same things. We're around people that are struggling with the same issues as we are, so they get it, they understand. But from that, Chi Nation has kind of grown. We first got started around like environmental work. So our first ever event we did was around the KXL pipeline. Putting on a protest here. It was the largest protest here in Chicago for the pipeline. So we're pretty proud about that. But then also including environmental work is just doing neighborhood walks. So going into these communities around the city and taking them outside in the environment and teaching them about the plants that are around them. So giving them that connection to the land is really important. So it helps them understand us, but it's also helping them understand how they should walk with a purpose on our land. And from there, we have a steady 7 to 10 kids in the youth council, and each of us have our kind of own initiative that the youth council is used as a platform to uplift our voice. So one thing that I'm very passionate about is eliminating race-based mascots, so things like the Blackhawks and the Redskins, and just teaching about that, teaching how they're harmful to Native youth. So I kind of started in my own school, trying to get the schools to ban students from wearing mascot clothing or Native-inspired clothing because it's harmful to us. So I would get in fights constantly every day at school because just having to explain myself. And one thing that those logos do is what it does to non-natives is it thinks that that's what Native people look like. And today, in 2018, Native people are mixed just like anyone else. So I'm mixed, I'm Black and Native. And what those logos do for me is when I'm in school or when I have to stand up and say I'm Native and I have to speak out against a teacher, I'll usually get the, oh, well, you don't look Native, or you don't look like that mascot, that kind of, those words towards me. So it's very personal to me. But also just raising awareness, and through those actions and through Chi Nation's help, I applied to be Champion for Change for the Center for Native American Youth. So they're a program of the Aspen Institute that was started by Senator Byron Dorgan from North Dakota. He's retired now. But that gives us a national platform. That gave me a national platform where I'm able to kind of travel around the country and explain about the work that I'm doing. But more importantly, I don't use that to kind of uplift myself. It's very important to me because a lot of the times urban Native youth are completely looked over by non-Native organizations and even by Native organizations a lot of the time. So for me, it was very important to use that platform as a national youth and give it to the youth here in Chicago. So whenever they did something, I would make sure I would report it back to CNAY so it'd be heard. One of our youth members, I was put in contact with Teen Vogue, and they were doing an issue around gun violence. And then someone in our youth council works around gun violence. So I was able to make that connection for them, and they were published in Teen Vogue, and they wrote an op-ed, which is something that it made me very proud, and it was pretty inspiring too to see that. And then so just being the national youth, it's also highlighting my Native community here in Chicago, and a lot of the work that I do is because I see that it makes my community happy, but I also see that it makes my community happy as well. And then I just want to give a shout out. So my aunts are in the crowd. They're sitting two totally different spots, but they're a big reason why I do a lot of the work that I do, because I see that makes them happy. Janie's up here in the front, and Fawn's in the back, hiding.
Nice. Welcome. So we're going to pass around some 4x6 cards for you, or 3x5s, to write questions on there if you would rather write them on a card. If you'd rather speak it, we'll also let you do that. But we're going to pass those around right now. So you can motion to them that you have a question you'd like to pose. Cynthia, one of the things you were mentioning is about the work here at UIC, and because of Cynthia's initiative, we're soon to be given an official charge for a task force to be set up. The initial charge will come from the Office of Diversity, and I want to introduce Professor Joshua Rudinsky, and who, along with myself, are going to be the co-chairs of that task force on natives here at UIC. And the idea is to find ways and identify ways and resources to make UIC a more friendly place for not only students, but for staff and for faculty. See if we can get our numbers up over here at UIC. Okay, so cards are going around for any questions or comments that you might have. I'll kick it off. Janine, I wanted to ask you first to remind folks on the date of the Relocation Act, and then I want to ask you also, and then any of the others of you may chime in, on the issue on jobs. If when they were, when Native folks were told, go to these cities, and you will find opportunity. And then they came here and they weren't finding that opportunity. So if at that time there were jobs, was there then job discrimination? To the extent that they did find jobs, was it in, thank you so much, was it in, what industries did natives work here? And for Janine and for any of you who might know.
Hello? Okay, that's a loaded question. So your first question was the dates?
Yeah.
So it was, I want to say it was 1953. It was in the 50s. I couldn't, I'll have to look that up. Mm-hmm. But really the history of the legislation of moving American Indians all around the country off our traditional lands, into cities, off onto reservations, the whole 9 yards. Really, the Relocation Act was an extension of a lot of other acts that started back in the 1800s. When our people left the reservations and came into the cities, there were no real jobs waiting. like I mentioned. But what ended up happening is that a lot of our folks ended up, it sort of depended on the city in which they moved to. So like I know for Seattle, Seattle was also a relocation city. We had a lot of, there's a lot of blue collar work. So a lot of our people ended up doing sort of blue collar work, or there was some service industry work that happened then.
Great.
And yes, there was discrimination, but there was discrimination against everybody then. So it wasn't just a Native specific discrimination that happened back in the 50s and 60s. That was sort of across the board for anyone who wasn't white applying for work.
And just as I was asking that question, a question came up that's related to this one, which is, and this, again, this would be to any of you. Do you know of any particular initiatives or focus on employment issues and Natives? Opportunities or initiatives that direct Natives into work? Either here or nationally.
There should be one locally that I know Heather can speak to, but nationally, so a part of the treaty-making process with American Indians throughout history was that employment, housing, education were all to be provided on the reservations. Some of those programs left the reservations and followed the Native person to the cities. It took a long time for them to get there. But the Department of Labor actually has the WIOA, the Workforce Employment Investment Act. So that is actually singularly the largest federal funding source for American Indian employment in the country. They fund about $22 million a year to, I want to say, about 30 or 40 different cities.
And that's channeled through the state into the cities, and then if there were folks that know folks who'd want to get access to some of those opportunities, where might they go for that?
You would find out who your local WIA provider is,
And that's where Heather's going.
Almost. So one of the things that the Indian Center has done in the past has been home to a variety of different organizations that could just provide all kinds of help to Native communities. One of those organizations was the California Indian Manpower Consortium. They're now outside of our building in their own separate facility, but they are the job providers for Native folks here in the city. So they provide job training, they provide assistance, they help with transportation, they have lists of all kinds of job resources and opportunities for Native folks. So they're typically the place that we would send anyone looking for that type of information here in the community.
Another question looks at the issue of gentrification. So especially around the Uptown area. And Heather, I see you nodding your head, so maybe you've got the mic there. Talk a little bit about how gentrification and the urban restructuring up there is affecting Natives in Uptown area or other parts of the city.
Absolutely. So the Indian Center just recently moved to a new location. We have relocated to Albany Park, but prior to that, we were in the Uptown area. Our center was located there just because during the relocation era, so many Indian folks were literally just dumped in Uptown. That's where they landed. And so it made sense that our center would actually be housed there just so we could connect to the community that was literally being dropped off. And so what we're finding now is that many of the folks and the families that we've worked with for generations are really struggling to continue to live in the Uptown area. They're struggling to even live in the north side where we've relocated. And so we're dealing with seeing a lot of our communities move out to the suburbs, move out to the south side. And so we're trying to figure out how can we as a center still remain relevant? How can we still continue to provide engaging programming when our community is going way outside of the place where we kind of always had this historical presence. And so we know that that is actually a major factor that we have to deal with here in Chicago. And we are also getting really creative in thinking about ways to help mitigate that. So we're looking at different opportunities when it does come to housing and thinking about, well, is there a possibility that maybe in the future the Indian Center itself could actually provide housing, and what would that look like? So we're in big talks with HUD, and we're in conversations with some development companies right now just to see what possibilities are out there and how can we actually bring the community back to one central location, so that way we do have folks in one particular area, and so we are able to build up that community again. So it's kind of an exciting time for us right now to think about that, given those big challenges of gentrification and what that looks like here in Chicago.
Thank you.
So our Shy Nations, actually, we just did 2 youth, Adrian and Eli, were just on another panel. They spoke with Hoodwa Z. It's a radio talk show, and they spoke specifically to this issue, so they'd probably be the best ones. But a big thing that the Youth Council does that I think helps fight gentrification is going into these communities and is taking them out in their communities and giving them that connection to the land. I think when you look at communities that are displaced or moved or gentrified out of their neighborhoods, you see that they don't have that connection. You see that there's no green spaces for them, or if you look on the south side, they have like the bomb trains going by. But I see a big change when we're taking people out and we're giving them that connection. We're like, oh, well, you could use this plot of land to plant native plants. These are the plants you can plant. And just teaching them about the plants that they can use for themselves for medicinal purposes. And then just teaching them how these plants aren't just plants, how these plants are relatives. And then when you have that connection to the land, it's a lot harder for them to come in and for them to move you, for them to pick you up and just drop you off in another place. Because that place now isn't just some place where you live and you go home to sleep and lay your head, but that space is your home now. That the community you're with is your home, those plants are your home, and everywhere you're at is just, you're related to it.
So here's someone who's looking for a database on all tribes and their territories in Chicago metropolitan area, the 7-county area. Looking for spatial files would be best. Do any of you know if there's anything like this that exists, and who might they contact to find out? Where do the numbers come from?
I'll start off. I feel like it's a complicated answer. Database, I'm not sure I know of one. I know there's lots of resources. I'm just thinking about this from the perspective of trying to create a land acknowledgement and what tribes, but as Heather mentioned, this Chicago, this area has always been historically very intertribal. You can connect to so many, and which tribes do you acknowledge or not, and do you only go by treaties? And that's also not our way of maybe recognizing being of a place versus from a place, or I'm not sure if I'm using the right language, but there's not a, I think often with a lot of the knowledge, it's not like you can just go to a book and get answers. It's about being in relationship with people and yeah.
Well, I think that's related to this next question.
Well, I'd let anybody want to add.
Which is that if there aren't a lot of folks if in Chicago there are many who are not enrolled in various nations, then how can UIC, for example, better reach Native communities to support and partner with them, especially young people?
We run into that question all the time, that challenge. And, For my tribal nation, I am enrolled. It's not necessarily, its enrollment is dependent on tribes. They're self-governing nations, and they decide who their members are. I'm sure if there's some tribal nations that have descendancy, and they recognize that as well. Here at UIC, we don't necessarily have a lot of Native students who are tribally enrolled. We have students who have self-determined through their descendancy and their family stories, their tribal connections, and through no fault of some of their families, some of those families have been disconnected, either through relocation, foster care system, adoption, any number of ways. And so it's, I'm of the belief that when students come to me, I'm not a culture police. I'm not gonna sit and decide one way or the other. But I do think it's important that students, anybody, knows those histories, knows that descendancy, and recognizes that. It can get very complicated, especially when we have students who are looking for scholarships, or there's different types of admission policies across the nation. And those are complicated issues. So I don't have all the answers. For our program, it is guiding the students through the process of being here, but also guiding them through the process of how they identify and recognizing their identities and their family histories. And for some of them, that information is lost.
Well, Cynthia, you know a little bit about Bernardo Gallegos' work?
Yeah.
Do you
Well,
wanna-
I couldn't really necessarily speak on it, but like for the Genezaros, there's just a different history. So wherever you are across the country, there's also different policies and histories that are with their tribal nations. And I'm not the expert on this. I would put that back to Janine. But I would say that for us with our program, it's more of like empowering our students to know their histories and to make those connections, but also giving back and not falsely giving information out that isn't their own to tell. And so for how, it kind of goes to data, back to data. So data is a complicated topic as well, especially on an urban public institution here. We run into it a lot. The numbers that you see and the numbers we have, how students self-identify when they come into UIC, and when they're here, where does that identification lie? And for our program, we've helped students enroll with their tribe as well. And because their parents were relocated here and didn't do that. And so while they're here, they're reconnecting with that, and they do have the right to enroll with their nation if those policies pertain to them, like if that's open for them. My daughter I'm born and raised in Chicago. I'm enrolled Rosebud. I always say I'm from Chicago. I'm a native from Chicago. My daughter is definitely born and raised in Chicago. She's of 5 different tribal nations, but she's only enrolled with one tribal nation, and because they have open enrollment policy. But it's also, as a mom, it's important for me to raise her knowing those histories, and also to recognize her stories and her family stories of where we are, and also to connect to what's important for our communities, our tribal communities. And it's important for her to be connected to the local Native communities, because this is her extended family.
Janine, do you want to
I
add
hope that
anything
helped.
to that? You don't have to, but.
I would say that obviously it's a really complex. I mean, we all just heard about Elizabeth Warren, right? It's complex. There's just no getting around it. So for the NUIFC, for a lot of urban centers, just as an FYI, this may look different in universities, but unless you're a health clinic, most urban Indian organizations do not require that you be enrolled. Generally speaking, our communities, we know each other. We know who the families are. We know we've created community, and I think that community is, often being Native is less about your blood and more about who you are in community. And a lot of our communities do know one another. And if we don't know you, we're going to welcome you in anyway, and we're going to make you an Indian. That's well, yeah, that's true. But again,
Depends on
it's,
how you behave, right?
yeah, exactly. It really does depend on the individual. It depends on, identity is a really complicated issue for all humans. And I think for Native people, we're both a racial identity, but we're also a political identity. And I think knowing that we're both of those things is what makes us a little more complex, because you can't talk about Native people without talking about enrollment. And we're the only people in America who have to enroll into something in order to be who we are. So I think it can get a little bit complicated around there. But just as an FYI, for most of our urban Indian centers, we don't require it. And most of our kids are, like what Cynthia just said, I'm 4 tribes. Most of our kids are like 4 or 5 tribes these days, or mixed with other races. So there's no easy answer to that.
So hold the mic. I'm going to ask you this question and then ask everybody else too. So this is another question. These are all questions from the audience. Is there a difference between saying Native American versus American Indian?
So when we were forming the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, we spent a full day on that question. Every Native person in every organization I know, that's the one, we get that question a lot. We use them interchangeably. There are some things that we use that, that's so complicated. Go ahead.
I think I would say if there's a specific tribe you can refer to, I feel like that's a preference, like Oneida and Menominee. Native American to me is less confusing with Indian and India, but I know that some folks prefer still saying American Indian because that's what's written in laws and treaties, and so for legal purposes, referring to the legal language.
Yeah, and then I think one of the newest terms that we're also hearing and starting to really grasp is indigenous folks, because a lot of our younger generation too, and even some of our community members just sitting here, we're really looking at the different borders that we have put in place, and we recognize the fact that for many of our tribes, we've got family across those now borders, and we never recognized those borders. And so to really look at that term of indigenous folks and to start thinking bigger picture to include those relatives from outside of what we recognize as the United States is also a term that we start using these days.
Mm-hmm. So part of the history, of course, of Native people in the Americas is the history of colonization, and then the impacts of that colonization. So here's a question: colonization impacts every facet of life. Entrenched and institutionalized in the U.S., besides public policy and social work in Native communities, what are other effective ways that colonization, or at least the impacts of colonization, can be deterred? Any examples, models, ideas on that? And even to broaden that question a bit, I mean, how do we deal with the continuing impacts and ramifications of colonization? And does it continue in various forms? And if so, how do you think? It opens up a big world, right?
So one thing that the youth council is, give us land. This is our land, so give us land. And that's something that our youth council has been asking for since 2012, before we started. Just a couple years ago, someone actually did just give us land. They just gave us their backyard to plant our traditional foods. So things like doing that for Native people, not speaking for us, without us. Yeah, I mean, the youth council was, for a couple of years, we're working with each other, and we actually got a piece of land in the Albany Park neighborhood, so it's in partnership with the Indian Center. But the youth council is the one that have been pushing for this for years. So we went to Alderman Carlos Rosa, asked for a plot of land. It's pretty big. It's, I don't know, it's almost about a half a block to a block. But that space is going to be used as like a healing space, and he just gave it to the Native community, so it's here for everyone to use. It's also going to be used as a teaching space for people in the Albany Park Community Center. So
Thank you.
getting involved, but not overstepping your bounds. Like you could, it's nice for people to learn about our culture and be there, but not to take up space. Like if you're there, then stand in the back and listen and let us do our thing. Yeah.
I mean, certainly, we talk about so many of Native folks being in cities now and off for various reasons, both forced and relocated into cities. But it seems like a lot of the history, the legacy of the colonization is in those, in the Native lands, right? And some of the ways in which it continues, things like the Keystone Pipeline, things like, what we heard just in the last couple of years under this administration, wanting to drill, for example, in Chaco Canyon, wanting to drill around the Ground Canyon where the Havasupai are, and opening sort of native lands to drilling. Any thoughts on that as it relates to this question?
I would say that one of the, again, that's such a huge question. If you live in America, you're a product of colonization, whatever your race. One of the bigger sort of non-land-based effects of colonization that we see really strongly within urban communities is really around child welfare. So when you think about historical trauma and what historical trauma has done and what boarding schools did, you really begin getting into sort of the deeper echoes of the harm that colonization has done to our communities and continues to do through today. And that really comes in the form of boarding schools. So most of us sitting at this table have a grandmother. In my case, both of my grandmothers were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to abusive boarding schools. What that did to our communities is beyond description, really. It took a very traditional way of parenting that our people have had for a millennia. Forever, we had ways of parenting our children and teaching our children. And what boarding schools did is it cut it off. It amputated it right there on the spot. So we have a generation of young people who grew up in boarding schools who were never shown how to parent. And what that did to our communities reverberates through today. And that's straight colonization. That is kill the Indian, save the man going on right there. And it's not that long ago. So I think one of the parts of sort of the invisibility that we have as Native people is that it was strategically designed to be that way. We were made to be invisible so that we're not necessarily included in these larger conversations, because America doesn't like to acknowledge that to some degree. But I would say that, so sort of around child welfare is a big one, our kids in foster care, the need for the Indian Child Welfare Act. All of these, I think, are sort of deep personal impacts of colonization, and also for just everyone in the audience who's non-Native to remember that that wasn't that long ago. My grandmother, my father's mother went to boarding school. My mother up in Canada went to boarding school. So I think that, people tend to think of Indians as all of this terrible crap happened like generations ago, and that's really not the case. I mean, we're talking fairly recent history for our people. I don't know if that answered the question.
No, that's very relevant. very relevant. And especially when you look at sort of indigenous knowledge, right, and cosmologies. And I was just looking at one of the PBS programs last night, and they were talking about designs of ancient cities, right? Not so ancient, but of cities like Tenochtitlan and even ones in the Mississippi Basin, right? And the sophistication in which there was a connection to stars and the movement of the seasons, right? And relating that to actual design, developing the grid system. We like to think that it was male Europeans that developed the grid system, but it wasn't, right? And so much of the intelligence and the knowledge, right, is part of what also gets cut off, right, through these processes of colonization. And we get in the sort of that we get separated, right, from our knowledge of our ancestors to current day living, right? And yet there is so much knowledge and understanding and depth. Is there anything in particular, some aspect of deep indigenous knowledge that you want to highlight, any of you? That you have that has either survived, that through your own experience survived through your families, or you've retrieved?
I think I would just add that, like, the concept that Chicago is indigenous land, it's always been, always will be, and that connection, like, or the term, like, off reservation or away from our homelands. No, this is our homeland. This is all Turtle Island, and raising my kids to see it that way, that there's not a deficit, that we're not disconnected. Like, I know that we've tried to pave over and change it to make it seem like to erase us physically, but our medicines still grow through the cracks on the pavement, and we still are here, and yeah, just keeping that in my mind and spreading that to my children as well, is that we've had a continued presence in this place, even despite removal, relocation, all that. Like, we've always been here, and this will always be.
For me, so answering that question, I guess it would vary from different people. But I would say, like, Native people are sometimes very protective of our knowledge, because a lot of the times institutions like universities and other large institutions, they like to come into our communities and they like to take our knowledge systems and like to use it as their own. Like they just like it's this new thing that they just came up with. But for me, one thing that I guess I would like to share is how Native people are raised. So me, I was raised not just by my mom, but by my three aunties, my grandpa, and the community. I think it's important to realize when it comes to Native people that it's not like your typical white American family. It's not a mom, a dad, and two kids and a dog. But Native people, we're a community. We raise each other. So if I see someone's kid running around and he gets hurt, I'm going to go help that child. I'm not going to go say, hey, you need to go help your kid, because that kid is my kid too. That kid is part of the Native community. Yeah, so just like communal raising and recognizing that like our values and our family values aren't the same as like American family values.
I just want to add that for us, we tend to want to clump all Native Americans together as one. So going back to the word Native American or American Indian, and I feel like it's important for us to recognize there's shared histories among us, but there's also our own histories within our own tribal communities, our own tribal nations. And it's important to recognize that there's diversity within our communities as well. And so not to put like a blanket knowledge or umbrella across all of us to always lump us together as this or that. But we have a variety of ways we've worked with the government or within our communities, or stories or ceremonies, languages, all of that. Of course, there's shared histories that have happened, but there's also just diversity within us as well. And so I think for Chicago and the urban community, I think that's also what our challenges we face as well as working together, is that there are different ways that people have engaged with policy or practices, and we're always negotiating, well, sometimes negotiating, fighting, whatever you want to call it, to bring better services or resources or however we go about that. But there's also within our own tribal nations, there's different ways of how we're practicing our traditions and what that means for our children and their children. And being in an urban community, that is a challenge, and it can be difficult to maintain those as well as like reconnecting for that. So I like what Anthony said earlier about like wherever we are is a way to connect to the land and all of us with any of our stories and our histories. That is a big connecting factor, is that we all connect to our land in various ways, and we recognize those relatives that aren't necessarily just person to person, but relationships to the land, plants, to our stories, our language, to animals, all of that.
So I'm so glad, Cynthia, that you brought out this issue of the diversity, right, among various nations. They're not all equal, don't necessarily, I mean, not equal, I mean, they're not all the same, right, don't necessarily have all the same histories, and yet there are still some things that are very much in common. I'm wondering, have any of you ever traveled to the Gathering of Nations? Any of you gone to that? Janine, you want to say a little bit about the Gathering of Nations and just the beauty of it and maybe what goes on there?
Albuquerque?
Mm-hmm.
It's super fun. It's like the world's biggest powwow with like every Indian from America at it. And the jewelry's to die for. It really is spectacular. And I think part of what makes it so spectacular, and not just the Gathering of Nations, any of our powwows in any of our cities or even on our reservations, is that when you see, for us as a Native person, when I go to, I'm Oglala, so powwow is also part of my heritage, but I'm 3 coastal tribes, and we're not powwow tribes. We don't do powwows in the Pacific Northwest, never have, never will. But I think part of the beauty of when you go to large indigenous gatherings, wherever they are. I've been to ones in Central America. I've been to ones in South America. Been to one in Australia. Is that when you have a group of indigenous people from anywhere come together to celebrate, you really do feel a kinship. There's something very powerful about that, because you realize that not only are you part of and witnessing, you're seeing centuries and centuries and centuries that have survived colonization. So, we can go on and on and on about all the negative crap that's happened to Native people as a result of all of this. But the beauty is that we're resilient. We're still here. I mean, you tried to kill us all off, but we, all of us, we're related to the people who survived. So those of us that are left are super strong, is what I like to say. But I think that's part of what that is. Part of the beauty of the Gathering of Nations is that what you're really seeing is resilience in action, and history in action. And I think that's something that's really beautiful.
Yeah, good, thank you. Recently this came out last year, and somehow I missed it last year, but I caught it a few nights ago, or a couple weeks ago, I guess. A film called Rumble. Have you've seen it? I don't know if you want to comment on it too, but I highly recommend it to all of you music lovers. You can catch it on Amazon Prime. Not that I want to promote Amazon Prime, but it's the subtitles, "The Indians Who Rocked the World," and it's an amazing film on how influential Natives have been in shaping music in the United States, including blues, jazz, and rock. And so I'm wondering, not only if you've seen it, maybe you want to comment on it, but also to comment, maybe all of you, on the significance of the drum. And
Um, like the powwow drum, big drum.
Any drums is part, I mean,
Um,
and
So-
although I know the women were like looking at each other, because one of the problems, right, is that it's been typically the purview of guys to play the drums, right? But that's changing, right?
So it varies from tribes. So like Lakota women don't sing on the big drum because, and the story behind that is because women can create life, and the big drum is a gift from the women to the men. So when you hear a drum, you'll hear like a heartbeat, and so that drum is supposed to be creating life, and there's knowledge behind our drum system. So we use it in powwows. And side note, not all natives powwow. So a lot of people think that like you're not native if you don't powwow. That's not true.
Yeah, as Janine just pointed out too, right, in the Pacific Northwest there, for example.
But yeah, we use the big drum in ceremonies and in powwows. But the big drum is mainly so like for powwows, there's 4 circles. You have the big drum. You have the men that sit around the drum. You have the women that sing behind the men, and they're kind of there to make sure that the men are doing what they're supposed to do. And if they want, those women can go in and they can take that drum from those men if they're not acting appropriately. Then you have like your powwow dancers and your spectators. But like the story behind the drum is you'll see men have like the drumsticks, and it's called a takai. So that's Cree for penis. So when it touches that drum, again, it's like creating that life, creating that heartbeat. It's different from tribes. So like Ojibwe women, they can sing on hand drums, but I can only speak to my tribes.
So in many native traditions or native cultures, right, there's native nations, there are strong matrilineal lines. Cynthia, what are you about to say?
Yes, my family's matrilineal. I rule the world. No, but I did want to put just a plug in. So there is going to be a powwow here at UIC, sponsored by the Native American Support Program and the Native American Student Organization. It's this Friday in Illinois Room, and it starts at 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. It's free and open to everyone, and you should bring your friends, your family, and come and hang out with us, and you can learn some more. Yeah. Oh, there'll be food too. And vendors.
A few more questions, and we're gonna wrap up here. But to the person who asked about the data, do you want to explain the question? Are you still here? You want to explain that question a little bit, because you're mentioning also about HUD, the new categories in HUD, I guess. But go ahead and explain your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Agata. I work for CMEP, which is a regional planning agency, and I'm trying to find out the way to prepare the land acknowledgement properly and be accurate. And that was my question, how to figure out which tribes should we acknowledge so we won't miss any important information, we won't offend anyone. That's why.
I think that you could probably speak to all of us up here, because all of our orgs, I think, have done a land acknowledgement. And just talking with Native people, the Youth Council actually today, in partnership with Alderman Rosa again, we submitted a resolution to the City Council for the City of Chicago to do a land acknowledgement. So it got put on their consent calendar, and what that means is just a bunch of resolutions combined, and they get passed either way. So the City Council will be doing a land acknowledgement, and I'll offer the Youth Council's help up to you as well.
Our service area extends to 7 counties, and as we move along from one county to the other, we thought that it might be ideal to have a way to
I think what's important as well when you're doing a land acknowledgement is while acknowledging the tribes is important, but actually physically acknowledging the land that you're standing on, like you're acknowledging the waterways, acknowledging that Chicago was a prairie and a swamp and an oak savanna, so giving the land an actual acknowledgement and the people as well. I believe the land is the biggest part of a land acknowledgement because we are land-based people. Without the land, essentially all of us are not.
People may not realize that all the diagonals in Chicago, like Milwaukee Avenue, were actually native trails prior to the city being built here. So Milwaukee was once a native trail. What are you going to go ahead?
Yeah. I would just add that you're heading in the right direction. You're asking Native folks, and I think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind with land acknowledgements is that they do have to be tied, to action, to actual relationship with Native communities, and so reaching out to the folks in those counties and being in relationship and in conversation with different communities and doing your research, but also building those relationships will really be important.
So that, Jasmine, that's a perfect segue into what I think will be our last question. And you all can take as much time as you need to answer. Actually, before I ask this last question, I got to make a comment. Does that mascot of the Cleveland Indians not drive you absolutely crazy? Right? That's just like, and the Redskins, right? Those are like the worst. So if we could get rid of those, right? Because they reinforce sort of the invisibility and the sort of just utter disrespect. So just got to put that in the record, man. That's the most hideous mascot I think that exists. I don't mind saying that on the public record either. It's like,
and
whoa,
to comment on that, like a lot of people will say they support indigenous people or native people, but they'll still come to our spaces in different spaces with like a Blackhawks jersey on. If you really support native people, throw your Blackhawks jersey in the garbage, and throw your other native jerseys in the garbage while you're at it too.
Well, especially if it's the Cleveland Indians or Washington Redskins. But anyway, all right, so here's my last question to you all. So what can people who, obviously everybody who's here and anybody who's listening in is genuinely cares and is genuinely interested and wants to be in solidarity and in alliance. So what is it that people can do to be connected to be supportive of, to be a good ally, to be in solidarity with? And I'm going to ask, Anthony, let's start with you, and we'll come on down this way, and we'll end with Janine.
I touched on it a little bit, is not taking up our space. So when we have Native events, they're not just exclusive to Native people. So you can come to our events, but don't take up space from us, because that's the only time that Native people actually have space to ourselves, because we're off, we're working in institutions or we're in institutions ourselves in school. So that space is for us, but it could be used as like a learning space. Again, give us land, give us your backyard plants, our native plants, but just not speaking for natives. If you're not native, you can't speak on native issues. A big thing that I always run into is I'm always running into non-natives saying how mascots aren't harmful and how mascots are honoring native people, but you're not native, so you're not really affected by it, so you don't get to talk on those issues. If you throw events, always leave a space for a native person. You may not know a native person is coming, but you should always leave that space for a native person to talk at your event. That's something that's always not done. Our voice is never heard. Yeah.
Cynthia. And Cynthia, remember, just invited you to a powwow on Friday night.
Yes. I would say learn the histories. Learn the history. I still, till this day, people don't know the history of our native history. You don't get taught that in high school. You don't get taught that in elementary school. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen anytime soon. But it's important that you learn that. You learn what relocation was, how boarding schools affected our communities, learn about contemporary issues are going on and how Native people are in those fights, and learn about Native leaders who are alive today and doing a lot of great work. Not to just put Native people in the past, but remember that there's Native leaders, there's Native families, children, youth who are making differences and doing good work in our communities. And I think that's like really important. And also come to the powwow on Friday.
If I can add to Cynthia's point real quick, you know, just like we have, there's African American studies, Black studies, Chicano studies, Puerto Rican studies, we have Native American studies. And there's a tremendous historians, Vindaloria, there's a whole bunch of folks who've written on this history, the sort of the various laws, the legal trajectories, there's just so much that's been written by Native American scholars. And also there's a lot of literature. You know, we all know the work of Sherman Alexie, for example. John Trudell is one of my favorites as a poet, no longer with us, at least in this land here. He's gone on with the ancestors. But there's just so many wonderful things that you can read in the world of Native American studies. And there's also a lot of really good films, too, that you can see, including Smoke Signals by Sherman Alexie, right, which is also one of my favorites. But anyway, go ahead, Heather.
Come to the Indian Center. We love visitors. We have a ton
And donate, too, right?
And donate. Oh, yes, we love that, too. Absolutely. We have tons of different programs, tons of different options going on. We update our website pretty frequently, so if you guys are interested in actually meeting some Native folks, come on over and hang out with us at the Indian Center. We're free. We're mostly free, always open to the public, and we welcome anyone to come participate with us. Another great thing that I like to tell people, and Teresa kind of mentioned this, but I've heard of this little search tool. You guys may have also heard of it. Google something about Native Americans. Google a Native American book, find a Native American author, and
there are a lot of good women ones,
yeah,
too.
exactly.
A lot of
and
great
read
women
them.
writers.
If you don't know who they are, come over to the Indian Center and we'll help you look through our library and provide you with some suggestions and some different options. So there are definitely resources out there, and there are ways to find out more information about who we are and about where we're from, and we're happy to help.
I would say do whatever you can to disrupt settler colonial normativity. I think, and I guess main thing I mean by that is whenever you can, just try to recognize and shed light that there was a living, thriving community here long before 1492, and there's behaviors, practices, beliefs, communities, exchange, political action, art exchange, everything that was here way before, names of places, stories here, and I think that's part of colonialism, is that it exists because of erasure, and that helps it exist. So I think doing what you can to shed light on all of that history before and today, but also if you're like me and you don't know all things about everything, ask questions. That was a tactic that I still use today when I don't know the question, but I just know something's not right, is I just ask a question, and it at least gets the folks who are in the room to maybe consider that too. And then hopefully then they go and learn more about it. I think you all coming to this talk or this panel today is a testament to you doing exactly that, and so I really appreciate you all joining us today and listening to our stories and our perspectives, and so yeah, keep doing it. I hope to see you again Friday. I'll be here. So.
I won't be here for Friday for the powwow, but I'm also from the Pacific Northwest. We don't powwow. I think allyship begins with relationship. So whatever that looks like. So I think, when I did the American Indian Ambassador Program, one of the things the Corps, they came up with, they went literally all over the globe, I mean, all continents where there's indigenous people, and they came up with 4 core cultural values that are shared by almost every indigenous group on the globe. And the first one was relationship. We are all in relationship with one another, regardless of whether we're Native or non-Native or whatever we are. And I think if we learn to respect that core value, and it speaks to what everybody here has already spoken of, is that relationship requires that you acknowledge that we're here and that we acknowledge that you're here. And you just build from that. And so I think there's no such thing as a stupid question as long as it's asked respectfully. I think that like Jasmine said, if you're here, you're already halfway there. You know a bunch of people in Chicago now. You can go ask your silly questions that you may be scared to ask somebody else. So I think that those are really important first steps in allyship. And I also think that wherever you are, I mean, a lot of you are students and you may leave Chicago and go off to other cities and do fabulous things in other cities, but take the time to learn on whose land you're on. I think that's really, really important because we were here and everybody in this country is standing on some tribe's traditional homeland. And I think just knowing who that tribe was is a really good first step in sort of acknowledging that we're still here and that we're still a community and that we're still thriving. And I think participating in Native community stuff is always welcome. And like our young brother at the end said, just be respectful when you do. Because we have, as Native people, we really do have, there was a joke for a long time that with every Native family was an anthropologist. So we've been really studied as a people, so we can be a little bit sensitive to that. But again, I think as Native people that we're open and that we just want to be your friend.
You know, we focus primarily on cities and urban cities, but just also as we're closing, just to remind us about some of the struggles in the rural areas and acknowledging the disproportionate impact, for example, of a lot of toxic contamination. And so there is a network, for example, the Indigenous Environmental Network, that does incredible work on fighting toxic contamination in their communities. And we in cities often benefit from some of that contamination because it's a lot of times it's from companies that are providing energy to the urban areas. And I think as much as we can be allies to some of these folks on some of these issues and support, right, those struggles for energy without contamination. So what a great joy that you all joined us. We really appreciate it. You have a final question or comment, Jacob? Oh, we have gifts for our presenters from the Native American Resource Center. Awesome. We'll let them present that. Go ahead. We'll let you present them, formally present them. These are students, the Native American Student Organization here at UIC. Oh, how beautiful. Nice. Cynthia, they're not giving you one, Cynthia. All right, to the Native American students here at UIC, yes. Thank you so much. It's really beautiful. You know, thank you all so much. We really, really appreciate your time. And oh, look at that, nice water bottles. We really appreciate your being here with us and your time that you've spent here with us this afternoon. And thank you again. We really appreciate it on behalf of Great Cities Institute and the Native American Support Services Center here at UIC. And thanks again to CAN TV.